So we were talking in the morning session about the importance of deepening as Baha'is. And we went over some of the requirements to develop that habit of studying the writings, namely having that thirst for studying, having detachment, and hard work. And we also went over some of the issues that prevent us, perhaps, from studying. And I put the caveat in there that I do enjoy those passages more that deal with the fear of God. So you'll see a little more of a shift in the emphasis towards those things. But I assure you there are writings that emphasize the mercy of God. But speaking of the fear of God, I came across this interesting hadith. Now, hadiths are sayings of Muhammad, or some of the central figures in Islam. They don't carry the weight of the text of the Quran, but people refer to them. And one of them I found quite amusing. It was hell. This is the setting. And so the people are sitting in hell. And all of a sudden the door opens. And this stench comes in. And the people of hell start complaining about the stench. And some new arrivals come into hell that are apparently emitting the stench. And so the people in hell start complaining about these people. And they say, who are you that you are coming here and adding to our miseries? We're already living a pretty bad existence down here. Who are you and what have you done that now you've thrust upon us this added stench? And those people turned to the old inmates of hell and said, we had the knowledge, but we didn't improve ourselves by it. I like that one. So we do have this responsibility as Baha'is to take a serious study of the writings. And we talked about at the end just how difficult it is, one of the reasons being that there's such a volume of writings that we have to get through as Baha'is. And I think there's no way around it. It's hard work. It's a lot of work. You know, there was Mr. Furutan would share this story fairly often at the Pilgrim House. When he was with the beloved guardian, he mentioned how the guardian would tell him about George Townsend and how Mirza Abul Fazl was the scholar of the East and George Townsend was the scholar of the West. And Mr. Furutan really wanted to meet George Townsend and had the first opportunity to do so when he was in Britain, and went up to George Townsend and said how much of an honor it was to meet George Townsend and what the Guardian had said about him and all of the wonderful things that the Guardian had said about him. And George Townsend dismissed it and said, that's the Guardian, he's kind to everyone. And then one of the Baha'is came up to George Townsend while Mr. Furutan was there and said, can I get your opinion on this particular passage? And George Townsend got a little frustrated at this and said, we don't have opinions in the Baha'i faith. We have the scriptures. And so the Baha'i said, poor guy, he said, it's just you know more than I do about the writings. And George Townsend said, of course I do. He said, it's because I read them. And if you read them as much as I do, you would know just as much as I do. So I think there's no two ways about it. At some point, as Baha'is, we have to take it upon ourselves to take this study seriously. And there are other passages that I wanted to get to, one of them which said, don't rely on speakers. Just to put me in my place. It also says, don't rely upon summer schools. And I assume that means winter schools as well. I don't think it's exempt. And there's a beautiful passage that I would like to get to, but it's a long passage by The Guardian. But it was one that was very inspiring to me, where it says that for every outward thrust of the Baha'i faith has to be an equally deep thrust of its roots. So if the tree of the cause is going to expand, if the tree is going to grow, which is teaching of the faith, it has to be met with a deepening of the roots, which Shoghi Effendi refers to as deepening of the faith, deepening our understanding. And he said that this is something that doesn't change. It's always going to be the case. We always have to do this as Baha'is. There's never going to be a time when we can say, okay, we've got it all. And the interesting thing is when you look at a tree, the majority of the tree is underground. It provides the support for the tree. If you didn't have the roots there and the tree just grew up, it would topple. But having the roots there supports it, and it also provides it with nutrition. That's where it gets all of its resources. In the same way that as deepening provides support for the Baha'i community, provides deepened Baha'is, provides firmness in the covenant, and also provides us with inspiration. If we're ever serving the Baha'i faith, and we feel tired of doing so, it's probably because we're neglecting this spiritual infusion that comes from adding our roots into it. Interesting statistic. A 4-month-old tree. 4 months old. How big is that? Does anyone know agriculture? 4 months old. How big is that tree? What's that? Depends on the tree. An average tree. We're getting technical here. Yeah, maybe this size, right? Okay, everyone kind of in agreement? Okay. Do you know how long the roots are? If you added up the length of the roots? Twice the size? Anything else? 10 times? 287 miles worth of root. That proportion is probably similar to what we have to do as Baha'is. We have the outward expansion, but as Baha'is, we always need to be delving deeper into the writings and pushing our understanding so that we can derive fresh inspiration on a daily basis. I think if we do that, then burnout will be to a minimum. Now, I just wanted to touch on one other thing about the last topic before we move on to the topic I'm supposed to be talking about. And that is the idea of it being feasible. Okay? How many writings do we have of the Baha'u'llah? Can people name them? In English. Alright, let's start with leanings. Kitab Iqan. Kitab Access. Hidden words. Prayers and meditations. 7 valleys. 4 valleys. Sorry, what? Tabernacle of Unity. Summon the Lord of Hosts. What did someone say? Epistles of the Son of Wolf? What's that? Kitabi'at? Okay, so that would be in tablets of the Baha'u'llah. Prayers and meditation. Gems. Divine mysteries. We have prayers and meditations. I think that's it. Unless you know something else. Okay. Now, how many pages are in each one? Gleanings, I wrote this down. But I need someone with a good calculator. I'm sure a lot of people have iPhones or iPads or whatever. We just need one person. It's a good excuse to check for email. Okay. So Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'llah is 346 pages. Okay? The next one, the Kitab Iqan, is 256. The Kitab Aqdas, 140. Hidden Words, 52. Prayers and Meditations, it's a long one. In fact, Shoghi Effendi said that Gleanings and Prayers and Meditations are supposed to go hand in hand. They're companion books. 7 Valleys, 4 Valleys?
How many for Prayers and Meditations?
Prayers and Meditations was 339. 7 Valleys and 4 Valleys? Around 70? About 70. It's fairly short. Then we have, what did I write there? Oh, Tabernacle Feast. That's 75 pages. Summons is 235. Epistle to the Son of the Wolf, 181. Tablets of Baha'u'llah, 269. And Gems of Divine Mysteries is 78. So that makes a total of how many pages of Baha'u'llah's writings in English? Is everyone in agreement? Oh, we have different editions. Okay, I'm going to go with 2041. Seems like we have a... Okay, so the total is 2041. So that's a lot. It's a huge amount of revelation. That's only the ones that are translated into English. But let's try and make it doable. Can you divide that number by 365? And tell me what you get. How much? 6. Oh. And then divide by 6 by 2. Hopefully you do not need a calculator. 3. That means, as Baha'is, if we read in the morning and in the evening, each session, 3 pages, we will have read within the course of the year the entire revelation of Baha'u'llah in English. Is that doable? Is that something we can challenge ourselves with? If you meditate while you read, it might take a little longer. But that's a good thing to do. So, Shoghi Effendi in one of his writings says that we have to, as Baha'is, develop the habit of studying. The habit of studying. We have to make it a habit. Now, there was a story of a woman who was walking down the street. And she noticed this really old man in this rocking chair. He was just sitting there, rocking back and forth. And so she goes up to the old man and says, "What is the secret of your life?" He said, "I smoke 3 packs a day." He says, "I drink a 6-pack of beer every morning." He said, "I eat whatever I want. I sleep whenever I want. I do all of those things." She said, "Wow, how old are you?" He said, "I am 26. So there are bad habits that we can have as Baha'is, but there are also good habits. And it's the good habits that we need to work on, okay? Now, I was looking up some scientific data about this, because I am kind of a scientist. And I was wondering how long it takes to make a habit. Does anyone know? Yeah, so lots of different answers. The answer is it depends on what you're doing. If it's something like drinking a glass of water in the morning, pretty easy thing to do. It takes on average 12 days to make that a habit. And a habit is when you change from it being something strange that you have to remind yourself to do, to flipping around and it's strange not doing it. Right? We've all felt that at the end of the fast. Right? We're taking the piece of food which was so natural to put in our mouth, and then we say, I shouldn't be doing this, and then you realize, wait, I can do it, and you still chew it a little guiltily, but you realize it's okay. So different things take different amounts of time. The more difficult something is, the more the longer it takes to develop a habit. So one of the things that we could do, perhaps, okay, rather than jumping into Baha'i studies and saying, I'm going to study 4 hours every day, from now on, perhaps we can make it something doable, something we can achieve. Because the easier something is to achieve, the more likely we are to make it a habit. With the goal that we try and increase that amount steadily. We try and stretch our habits. Stretching our habits is actually something that in the medical literature is good for us. It prevents Alzheimer's disease. You know that? It develops new pathways in the brain when you develop new habits. It allows for fresh insights when you develop new pathways in the brain. So these things are all healthy for us. So it's good for us as Baha'is, perhaps, to say, I'm going to make a habit of 30 minutes every morning to study the writings. I'll wake up for 30 minutes and try it. Try it for a month and see if it becomes a habit by the end of that time. All right. Moving on to the topic I was supposed to talk about now. And that is the Kitab Iqan. So it can be difficult. We talked about this jam study where they had 26 different kinds and people were paralyzed because they had so much variety out there. The Guardian actually makes it easier for us. He gives us particular writings that we need to focus on. There was a story about a man who prayed to win the lottery. Have you heard about this? He prayed really hard to win the lottery. Every night he prayed and prayed and prayed that he would win the lottery. Until he had a dream. And in that dream, the angel comes to him and says, we're working really hard up here to help you win the lottery, but you need to buy a ticket first. So it's the same thing in the Baha'i writings. All of that work is going on in the next world. We need to make a start. We need to start somewhere. And I think when looking at it, it doesn't really matter where we start so much as starting. But it's not a bad idea to be able to look at the sequence in which the Guardian translated things and use that as our guide as to the order of studying things, perhaps, or the level of import. I mean, the Guardian had incredible amount of work to do. The translation was a portion of what he did. And his time was very valuable. So any effort that he made, whether it was in the Dawnbreakers, whether it was in God Passes By, whether it was in translating the Kitab Iqan, was done so deliberately because it was felt that that was imperative for the needs of the faith at that time. So what were the writings that the Guardian translated? What's the first one he translated? So the first one was hidden words. The second one, what was the second? Correct. The third, anyone? What's that?
Gleanings.
Gleanings. Very good. The fourth?
Prayers and meditation.
Very good. And the fifth and final one?
Epistle.
Sorry, I meant specifically translations of the text of Baha'u'llah. Yeah.
Epistle to the Son of the Lord.
Correct. So each one of these had a purpose. And it's interesting to note that the Kitab Iqan had already been translated before the Guardian retranslated it. And so it was available. But it was such an important text that the Guardian retranslated it. And it was a difficult task. You know, Mr. Dunbar was referring to the rigor with which Shoghi Effendi would work on God Passes By, a spectacular volume. But the one thing that he wanted the Baha'is to do, all of this effort, was to read it, correct? Was to expose themselves to it. You know, whenever Baha'is would come on pilgrimage, the Guardian would sometimes ask them questions. And perhaps to get his fingers on the pulse of the level of understanding of the community. And there was this one Baha'i lady who was asked a question by Shoghi Effendi. And we should try and think how we would answer it, whether we would do any better. He said, after the martyrdom of the Bab, authority of the faith was transferred to Baha'u'llah. After Baha'u'llah, authority was passed to Abdullah. He said, to whom was authority passed after Abdullah? Think about how you would answer it. Don't say it out loud. This is how she responded. She said, to you, Shoghi Effendi. And he said, no. She said, to the guardianship. He said, no. She said, to the Universal House of Justice? He said, no. And this is the point in which she said her heart melted, because she saw that the Guardian was saddened by her responses. She said that the Guardian told her that the friends do not read his letters and do not read his messages. He said that if they had understood and read the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, his important letter, they would have understood that after the passing of Abdullah, authority was passed to the administrative order. And she didn't realize the wisdom of that lesson until the passing of Shoghi Effendi. So here is how the Guardian describes the Kitab Iqan. He said, this is one more attempt to introduce to the West, in language however inadequate, this book of unsurpassed preeminence among the writings of the author of the Baha'i Revelation. Baha'u'llah himself refers to the Kitab Iqan as the Lord of Books. Shoghi Effendi says, it is the most fundamental book of the Baha'i Revelation. Shoghi Effendi says again, the Iqan is the most important book written on the spiritual significance of the cause. He says, I do not believe any person can consider himself well versed in the teachings unless he has studied it thoroughly. Not read it once, Study it thoroughly. Shoghi Effendi hoped that you will exert all your efforts first in deepening your own knowledge of the teachings, and then to strive to attract other people. You should form study classes and read the important books that have been published, especially the Iqan, which contains the basic tenets of the faith. The one who ponders over that book and grasps its full significance will obtain a clear insight into the old scriptures and appreciate the true mission of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. One more quotation. The friends, and particularly those who wish to become competent and useful teachers. So those who want to become competent and useful teachers should indeed consider it to be their first duty to acquaint themselves as thoroughly as they can with each and every detail contained in this holy book, so that they may be able to present the message in a befitting manner. It is the guardian's hope, therefore, that those among the believers who have thus far, and for some reason or another, failed to make a serious study of this important work will be stimulated to do so, and will as a result deepen their comprehension of the essentials of the faith. So this is one aspect of why, as Baha'is, we should study the Kitab Iqan. Another aspect is, if we think in historical terms, humanity has gone through a period of 6,000 years in anticipation of this one book. 6,000 years of expectation for this one book. In the book of Daniel, are you familiar with Daniel? Daniel was captured by the Babylonians, right? Familiar with that? He was Jewish. He was captured by the Babylonians. Whenever these countries would invade another country or another, they would take the brightest from that conquered country and take them back to their homeland, to enrich their homeland with knowledge and so forth. So Daniel was one of those individuals. And he was taken to Persia, to modern-day Iran. That's where he was. And when he was in the vicinity of that area, he, probably feeling the force of Baha'u'llah emanating from that particular land, became inspired, had prophetic dreams and visions. And chapters 7 through 12 of the book of Daniel deal with the coming of Baha'u'llah. And there's all kinds of symbolism used. And when Daniel asked to be sure in the meaning of these things, he was told from on high, "But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased." I'm talking about that day, that knowledge will be increased. This happened. But this idea that the understanding of it was to be sealed. The understanding of prophetic vision is sealed. Shoghi Effendi identifies the Kitab Iqan as the book that unsealed those words of Daniel. Just think about the expectation people have been having for that. It's here. Now Christ, when Jesus came, he spoke things in parables, correct? He didn't speak directly. He spoke in stories, allegories. He said, "All these things spake Jesus unto the multitudes in parables, and without a parable spake he not unto them." He said everything in parables. And then when asked, Jesus said, "These things have I spoken you in Proverbs." Same as parables, in Proverbs. He says, "But the time cometh," talking about a future time, "the time cometh when I shall no longer speak unto you in Proverbs, but I shall shew you plainly the Father." So he'll speak in plain language, no longer in parables. And it's interesting, if you look at the writings of Baha'u'llah, there are certain passages where Baha'u'llah speaks in parables. If you look at Summons the Lord of Hosts, there's a very interesting example of that in the Iqan, where he speaks in a parable and then he apologizes almost for speaking in that language, because it's beneath him. We're supposed to be advanced enough so that we can understand these things, but he speaks in parables so that we can understand. He says the reason that he's doing so, he says, is so that they may transcend. Certain people may transcend a mere plant-like level of existence and attain unto true maturity. This is why he deigns to speak in that particular language. Christ also says, he says, "I tell you the truth, it is expedient." Expedient means what? Expedient. Quickly, efficiently. Necessary. It's an old English term. It is necessary for you. It is expedient for you that I go away. He says, "For if I go not away, the Comforter will not come unto you." So if I don't leave, then the Comforter, which is Baha'u'llah, will not come. He said, "But if I depart, I will send him unto you. And when he is come, he will reprove the world of sin and of righteousness and of judgment." Christ says, "I have many things to say unto you, but ye cannot bear them now." So Christ desired to say all of these things, but the capacity of humanity at that time was such that he had to speak in a very specific language, that of parables. He says, "Howbeit, when he, the Spirit of truth, is come," as identified with Baha'u'llah, "he will guide you unto all truth. For he shall not speak of himself, but whatsoever he shall hear, that shall he speak. And he will show you things to come." Then he says, "He," meaning Baha'u'llah, "shall glorify me. For he shall receive of mine, and shall show it unto you. All things that the Father hath are mine, therefore said I, that he may take of mine, and shall show it unto you." So Christ is saying that he will glorify me. He's also saying he will take of mine, meaning taking his words, and he will show it unto you. He will explain it. So you can see this thirst that the Christians have for this understanding that Baha'u'llah has brought through the Kitab Iqan. Now in the Quran. In the Quran it says, "He it is who sent down to thee the book." Okay? God sent down the book, the Quran. "Some of its signs are themselves perspicuous." What does perspicuous mean? What's that? Wide viewing. Obvious, right? Perspicuous. Blatant. Some of them are obvious. But some of the verses of the Quran are obvious. He says, and others are figurative. So there are two parts to the Quran. Some of them are obvious meanings and some of them are figurative. He says, "But they whose hearts are given to err, and those who are in the wrong way, follow its figurative verses, craving an interpretation." They really want an interpretation, they try and interpret it. Craving discord. So when they try and interpret these verses in their own way, it creates disunity, as we can see in the world. He says, "Yet none knoweth its interpretation but God." Okay? So there's this concept in the Quran. There are certain verses that are figurative, and that we don't know the interpretation of it, and the only person who knows the interpretation of it is the author of it, which is God. Then he says in the Quran, "Move not thy tongue in haste to follow and master this revelation." Don't try and master this revelation, the revelation of the Quran. He says, "For we will see to the collecting and the recital of it." Okay? The Quran means the recital. So we'll see to the collection of this Quran. But when we have recited it, when we have the Quran, he says, "Then follow thou the recital." Then he says, "And verily, afterwards," means later, "it shall be ours to make it clear to thee." We'll clarify it. The same kind of concept. There are certain verses that are not understood. There'll come a time when it will become understood. And this idea of making it clear, the translation of that in Arabic is bayan. Last verse from the Quran. "And now have we brought them the book. With knowledge have we explained it, a guidance and a mercy to them that believe." They have the book. What have they to wait for now but its interpretation? Now, in the Bab's writings, the Kitab Iqan was also anticipated. The major book of the Bab was which one? The Bayan. And the Bayan was organized in a very specific fashion. Does anyone know its organization? 19 chapters, each with 19 parts. Okay? So a total number of 19 chapters, 19 parts, 361. And this number 19, one of the things that there's a tradition in Islam where it says that all of the knowledge of the Quran, all of the understanding of the Quran can be found in the first chapter of the Quran. And then it goes on to say that all of the knowledge of the first chapter, all of the understanding of the first chapter is contained within the first verse. And if you add up the number of letters in the first verse, is 19. Okay? And there have been many Islamic scholars who have looked at this number 19 and found all kinds of interesting connections in this number 19. And so this was the organizational unit of the Bab's writing, the Bayan. And the chapters were referred to as Wahids, which means unity. 19 is also in the Abjad system is equal to the name of unity, or Wahid. And then the sections of those referred to as Babs. Now it's interesting because in the writings of the Bab, in the Bayan, it was left incomplete. Not all 19 chapters were completed. 11 were completed. So 8 of them were left incomplete. And they were left intentionally incomplete. And the Bab stated that he whom God shall make manifest would complete the rest of the Bayan. And Shoghi Effendi himself identifies the Kitab Iqan as the completion of the Bayan. Shoghi Effendi says, "The Bab specified that the Bayan is not completed and that he whom God shall make manifest, Baha'u'llah, would complete it, though not in actual form, but only spiritually in the form of another book. The Iqan is believed to be its continuation." So in the English version of the Kitab Iqan, there's one portion of the Kitab Iqan that's not in the English version that's in the original. Does anyone know what that is? It's the very last part. There's an inscription made at the very end that's not in the English version. This is what it is. 152. Now, if we look at this, I said there were 8 chapters that were unfinished. What is 8 times 19? Anyone have a calculator? 152. There were 8 that were uncompleted. 11 were completed, 8 were incomplete. The other significance of this, so in one sense, maybe Baha'u'llah is intimating that the Kitab Iqan is the completion of the Bayan. Another significance of it is the numerical value of 2 has an equivalent alphabet of the letter B. The number 5 has the equivalent value of the letter Ha. And 1 has the numerical value of, the alphabetical value of Aleph. So in Arabic, this is Baha. So Baha, 152, the completion of the Bayan, are all contained within that meaning. So the Kitab Iqan is a very fundamental book for Baha'is. And in it are contained numerous truths. The first thing that Baha'u'llah starts out with in this, well, let's get to the history of it. So the history of it is that it was revealed to one of the Bab's uncles. Does everyone know the story of this one? I don't want to go into the story too much if everyone knows it. But it was revealed to one of the uncles of the Bab. Now the Bab had prophesied that his family would recognize his truth eventually. Now, the Bab was very interesting because he didn't have a normal childhood. There are some very interesting stories of the Bab. One of them was when he was quite young in age. His father was still alive at the time. He was in the bathhouse, and he was sandwiched in between his father and his uncle, the one that embraced his cause and raised him, and eventually was martyred for the cause. And the Bab was asleep, and suddenly he woke up. And he said, "The steam chamber of Mirza Hadi has collapsed. The roof has collapsed. And 5 women and 1 children have been trapped, and they've been killed." And so the father and the uncle said, you're having a bad dream, go back to sleep, and so forth. And the Bab turns to them and says, "It is exactly how I say." And sure enough, a few moments later, people rush in and say, the roof of Mirza Hadi's steam bath has collapsed, and 20 women are trapped underneath. Another person comes in and says 30 women are trapped underneath. When eventually it becomes settled, 5 women and 1 child were trapped underneath. The Bab one time had a dream, and he went up to his father, and he shared this dream with him. He said, "Last night I had a dream where there was a big scale." You have these scales that have the balance on them. He said that the 6th Imam, which is a very important Imam in Shia Islam, Imam Sadiq, he said he was on one of the plates. And he said that the scale tipped over and was down on the ground. Then the Bab said, this is him as a child, he said, "An invisible hand took me and placed me on the other plate." And he said that the balance shifted and he was brought down lower than Imam Sadiq, meaning his station is higher than that. So you can imagine the astonishment of his family members in hearing these things. When the Bab would come across pregnant women, he would tell them the gender of their child. Another time, there was an instructor that came to see him. And he said to the Bab, "Come and read." Once again, when the Bab is a child. "Come and read this." And so the Bab says, as you please. So the teacher said to him, I want you to repeat after me, he is the deliverer, the all-knowing. It's a passage from the writings, from the Islamic scriptures. He is the deliverer, the all-knowing. Repeat it after me. The Bab remained silent. The teacher said, repeat it. The Bab remained silent. He said, repeat it. And the Bab said, who is he? When it says he is the deliverer, the all-knowing. Who is he? The teacher says, he refers to God. The Bab said, I am the deliverer, the all-knowing. The teacher was not too happy about that. You know, there's a tradition in Islam where it says that on that day, the Qa'am, the promised one, will change one word. He says humanity will be dumbfounded by that. One word will change. And in the writings of Baha'u'llah explains that that word that is changed is he is God to I am God. That he to I. You can see the effects of this. So you can imagine that the impression that the family members had about the Bab was not that of a normal relationship with a child. There was something very special about him, and his family knew that. And when he was martyred along with his uncle, one of the other uncles had not embraced the faith. And I don't want to go too much into the story because I'll take quite a while, but I think the thing that's interesting is what made the Bab's uncle go from a state of being an unbeliever to start questioning. And when a certain follower of the Bab was having a conversation with the uncle of the Bab, eventually the uncle of the Bab said, how is it possible that my nephew was the promised one? How is that possible? And the person, the Babi, who was teaching him, was trying to hold back a smile because he knew this would be challenging for him. And so eventually the uncle of the Bab persisted and said, why are you smiling? What is amusing about this? And he said, the same view that you had, the same view that you hold, how is it possible that my nephew was the promised one, is the same view that the uncle of Muhammad, who was not a good uncle, there was a good uncle and a bad uncle, but a very bad uncle had the exact same argument against his nephew. That was the turning point for the uncle of the Bab, because he realized he wasn't being fair. And at that point, he decided to investigate. And this individual encouraged him to go to Baghdad and visit the presence of Baha'u'llah and ask him his questions. And so when he asked his questions, the response came from that within 2 days and 2 nights in the form of the Kitab Iqan. How am I doing time-wise? 10 minutes. Okay. So the first theme that we reach in the Kitab Iqan is that of detachment and purifying ourselves. It's very important. The Bab says that that words themselves have a meaning, and that the power of the word depends upon the purity of one's heart. Okay? I don't know if you've ever experienced this in your life. But he says that the purity of the heart, that since the words themselves are an emanation from the soul, the power associated with that emanation depends upon the source, depends upon the purity of that heart. This is why the Bab says that if anyone were to utter the exact same words as he, if someone had come in a different part of Iran or a different part of the world and had said the exact same words as the Bab had said, he said it would not have the same effect, because the source of where he was coming from was of utmost purity. And I've had some very frustrating examples of this in my life. I had this experience when I was in college. I had two other Baha'is in my college who were there for a considerable amount of time while I was there, and both of whom had become Baha'is during their stay in college, both of them before I had met them. One of them was from Mississippi. She was in a sorority, then became a Baha'i, then stopped being involved in the sorority. Changed her life around. And she had an incredible reliance on prayer. Almost excessive. I remember one time we were driving around, and she put her foot on the clutch. And we're on a busy road, okay? And we're at a red light, and the light changed to green, and she put her foot on the clutch, and the mat on the floor caught the clutch, so she wasn't able to pull the clutch up, okay? So most people, including myself, would have reached down and pulled that mat, and then just the clutch would have come up. Not Julie. Julie decided this was a great time to say prayers for protection. So she reached into her glove compartment, where she had handy prayer books, along with the picture of Abdul-Baha there. It was the young picture of Abdul-Baha, which one of her friends asked, "Is that your boyfriend?" She said no. And then she reached into her glove compartment and pulled out a prayer book. Now mind you, this is a busy intersection. People are honking behind. She could very easily just pull off the floor mat. The clutch would come off. We could drive nicely. She pulls out her prayer book and she begins, "He is the King, the all-knowing, the wise. Lo, the nightingale of paradise." And she was not one to say it slowly either. So all these cars are honking, and Julie is there in the utmost serenity saying a prayer. That was her. So she had a very strong reliance on the power of prayer. But she was a very frustrating person to be on a teaching team with. We were teaching teams. And she was great at finding people. She'd bring them over to my place and we'd have a fireside. That's what we do. That's how we work. She was wonderful at attracting people through her spirit, her radiance. She would attract people. But it was one of the most frustrating experiences because they would ask a question, and I gave a very logical answer that I thought was quite satisfying, and I would get this quizzical look from the seeker. And then Julie would say something, but she'd say it with a smile and this bright eyes and this radiance, and they would say, "Ah, I get it. Uh-huh." So it was a good example to me of how important detachment, purity of heart is when approaching the Word of God. Baha'u'llah says, "No man shall attain the shores of the ocean of true understanding except he be detached from all that is in heaven and on earth." It's detachment. The very first commandment of Baha'u'llah in the Kitab Iqan is to detach oneself. It's the very same commandment that you can find in the beginning addresses of Christ on the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit. We need to detach ourselves. And one of the individuals who had an experience with the Kitab Iqan was Mirza Abul Fazl. Heard his story of how he became a Baha'i, how he became interested in the Baha'i faith. Some shaking heads. So he was an erudite Muslim clergyman. And one day he was traveling from town to town on a donkey with a friend. And the shoe of the donkey broke down. Now, you can't get very far with a broken shoe. It's kind of like driving with a flat tire. You can't exactly keep on going. So he stopped at a blacksmith shop where they would make horseshoes. And while the person was making the horseshoes, this person said, "I'm so honored by your presence. Would you perhaps maybe answer a question I have?" So Mirza Abul Fazl says, "Sure." He said, "Is it true that every drop of rain that comes down is brought by an angel? Is it true that there's a tradition about this?" And Mirza Abul Fazl said yes. And so kept on mending the shoe and repairing it and so forth. Let some time pass by. And then he said, "Would I perhaps be permitted to ask you another question?" Mirza Abul Fazl says yes. He said, "Is it true that an angel will never visit a house where a dog is contained in there?" Now, in Islam, dogs are seen as impure. And Mirza Abul Fazl says, "Yes, this is true." He didn't realize he'd fallen into a trap that this Baha'i was setting. He said, "How is it that rain falls alike upon houses without dogs and houses with dogs. It was a blow to Mirza Abul Fazl's ego. He had realized that this poor blacksmith had confounded his wisdom. And this Baha'i had done so deliberately, because he needed to chip away at his ego in order to recognize the faith. And so then Mirza Abul Fazl left and went to that town. And so the Baha'is went over to the other town and told the people that he'd weakened him. He chipped away at his ego, and they should keep on working at this. And so one of the Baha'is went up to Mirza Abul Fazl and was talking with him and invited him to a meeting. He had a bruised ego. Mirza Abul Fazl wanted the best and brightest Baha'i to be brought to him so that he could debate him face to face. And so this Baha'i, in his wisdom, invited the most illiterate, unknowledgeable Baha'is he could find to this gathering to meet Mirza Abul Fazl. Mirza Abul Fazl was not happy about this. He said, he was showing the Kitab Iqan. He said, in the beginning of it reads, Bismillah Rabbana al-Aliyyul Allah. In the name of our Lord, the most exalted, the most high. Now, the exalted is a title of the Bab. He knew that this was talking about the Bab as being the Lord. So he said, aha, this is wrong. You refer to the Bab as the Lord. That's wrong. So one of the illiterate Baha'is raised their hand and said, is it not true that in the Quran it refers to God as the Lord of Lords? And Mirza Abul Fazl said yes. So the Baha'i said, well, if he's the Lord of Lords, then surely there must be lords for him to be Lord over. And so it was another example of how they had whittled away at his ego until he became one of the most humble individuals in the history of the Baha'i faith and the most erudite scholar that we've known. And Mirza Abul Fazl said that he read the Iqan many, many times, tens of times, before he truly understood the Iqan. Now we shouldn't think that when Mirza Abul Fazl said that he read it, that he just read it from beginning to end. He was a scholar. He would study it. He studied it many, many times before he said he understood it. So I think, in summary, we're trying to think of ways in which we can tackle deepening ourselves in the scriptures of the faith of Baha'u'llah. One of the ways that we can do so is making a start. And I think an excellent place to start as Baha'is is the Kitab Iqan. There's a reason that Shoghi Effendi translated it so early. There's a reason that Baha'u'llah and Shoghi Effendi extolled the station of the Kitab Iqan. There's a reason for that. It's because as Baha'is, it's important for us to spend time deepening on it, whether it's by ourselves, whether it's getting a group of people together in a community to make a study of it, but it's something that we should try and tackle. Thank you.